Facing the darkness. As a father, nothing is more important to me than the safety and well-being of my son. Every night before he goes to bed, I make sure to check his room for any potential threats that could harm him. But one particular night, my son asked me to check for monsters under his bed. I obliged, thinking it was just a playful request. I crouched down and peered underneath his bed. There was nothing there but a few dust bunnies and some discarded toys. I turned to tell my son that his room was safe, but when I looked back under the bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another version of my son was lying on the floor, staring back at me with a terrified expression. His eyes were wide and filled with tears, and he was trembling violently. He looked exactly like my son, except for the fact that he was wearing a different outfit. "Daddy, there's somebody under my bed," the other version of my son whispered, his voice barely audible. I was frozen in fear, unsure of what to do next. My mind raced with all sorts of questions. Was this some sort of bizarre hallucination? Was I dreaming? Was my son in some sort of danger? Without warning, the other version of my son sat up and crawled out from under the bed. He stood up and took a step toward me, his expression still one of fear and desperation. I backed away, not sure what he was going to do. Suddenly, the other version of my son lunged at me, his hands clawing at my face. I stumbled backwards and fell to the floor, hitting my head on the nightstand. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the other version of my son standing over me, his eyes filled with malice. When I woke up, everything was dark. I could barely see anything, and I felt a dull ache in my head. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I was no longer in my son's room. Instead, I was in some sort of dank, cramped space surrounded by darkness on all sides. I tried to stand up, but my head spun and my legs gave out. I slumped back to the ground, feeling disoriented and helpless. All around me, I heard the sound of whispers and muffled voices, as though something was lurking just beyond my field of vision. Suddenly, I heard shuffling sound from directly behind me. I turned around, and there was the other version of my son, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. He smiled at me, revealing a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice filled with malice, "you should have checked under the bed." With that, he lunged at me, his teeth snapping shut around my neck. I felt a searing pain, and then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was back in my son's room, my neck throbbing with pain. I looked around, confused and disoriented. My son was still asleep, safe and sound in his bed. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear: I could never let my guard down, even for a second. The monsters were real, and they're lurking everywhere. They were hungry. I stumbled out of my son's room and made my way to the kitchen. The pain in my neck was still there, throbbing and pulsing with each beat of my heart. I reached for a glass of water, hoping to wash away the memory of what just happened. As I drank, I thought about what I had just seen. It was as if my son's room had been invaded by some sort of malevolent spirit, and one that was intent on harming us both. But why? What had we done to deserve this? What was going on? I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but they lingered, like a bad dream that refused to go away. That's when I heard it. A low, growling sound coming from somewhere deep in the house. I froze, my heart racing with fear. The sound grew louder and closer until I felt it right behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway shrouded in darkness. I reached for the light switch, but it wouldn't turn on. The power had gone out, leaving me stranded in a sea of shadows. As I stumbled down the hallway, I heard more sounds, more growling, more whispers. It was as if the entire house was alive, breathing and moving with a life of its own. I reached the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the center of the room, was the other version of my son, crouched on all fours, his eyes blazing with a hellish fire. "Daddy," he said, "you can't escape me. I am everywhere, and nowhere. I am your worst nightmare, your deepest fear. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the spot. The other version of my son stood up and advanced on me, his teeth bared and his claws extended. I closed my eyes and prayed for it to be over, but when I opened them again, I was back in my son's room, the sun streaming in through the window. It was just a nightmare, I told myself, a bad dream that gotten out of hand. But deep down I knew that it was more than that. It was a warning, a sign that something was coming, something dark and terrible. I looked down at my son, who was still sleeping peacefully. I knew that I had to protect him no matter what. I couldn't let the monsters win. I had to be strong, for his sake and mine. And so I took a deep breath and stood up, ready to face whatever came my way. I was a father, and I would do whatever it took to keep my son safe, even if it meant confronting the monsters under his bed. I took a step towards my son's bed, steeling myself for what I might find. As I crouched down and peered underneath, I saw nothing but the usual clutter of toys and dust bunnies. I breathed a small sigh of relief, but then a movement caught my eye. There in the far corner was a shadowy figure, barely discernible in the dim light. It was small, hunched over, and seemed to be staring back at me. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was hallucinating. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, clearer now, more defined. It was another version of my son, just like the one I had seen in the living room, but this one was different. It was younger, more innocent, more vulnerable. It was as if I was seeing him as a baby again, fresh out of the womb, with all his life still ahead of him. And yet there was something else there, something darker, something that whispered of danger and violence. I reached out to touch him, but my hand passed through him like a cloud of smoke. He quivered and shrank back, as if afraid of me. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why did you leave me here? Why did you let me die?" My heart skipped a beat. I knew what he was talking about, even though I didn't want to believe it. The memories flooded back, unbidden and unwanted. The night my wife had died in childbirth, screaming in agony as her body convulsed with pain. The moment when I had seen my son for the first time, blue and lifeless, no breath in his lungs. Weeks of mourning, the endless hours spent in the hospital watching his tiny body struggle to survive. And then finally the day when he had opened his eyes, looked up at me and smiled. But that smile had been short-lived, because soon after he had started to change, to become something else, something that wasn't human, something that was older, darker, and more dangerous. And now here he was, in this strange and eerie form, asking me why I had abandoned him. "I didn't abandon you. I never left you. I've always been here, watching over you, protecting you." But the figure just shook his head and vanished into thin air. I was left alone with nothing but the dust and the shadows. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do, where to go. All I knew was that something was happening, something that threatened to tear apart everything I had ever known. I stood up and walked towards the door, my resolve hardening with each step. I would be the protector, the defender, the shield. I would do whatever it took to keep my son safe, to keep us both alive. And so I opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. The night was silent, but I knew that it was only a matter of time before the monsters came. And when they did, I'd be ready. I made my way down the stairs, every step echoing loudly in the silence. As I reached the bottom, I saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was coming from the door. My heart racing, I ran toward the light. As I drew closer, I could see the door was ajar and a faint glow was seeping through the gap. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The world outside was a blur of shadows and darkness, broken by the occasional flicker of distant street lights. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, and then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure walking towards me through the darkness. It was tall and imposing, with broad shoulders and a menacing gait. I could feel the fear rising up inside me, threatening to overwhelm me. But then something shifted. A fierce determination that took hold of me, and I realized that I had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, I stepped forward to meet the figure, and as I got closer, I saw that it was not a monster or a spirit, but a man. A man with a face that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. He looked at me, his eyes flickering with recognition, and then he spoke. "Dad." It was my son, but not as I had ever known him. He was older now, more mature, with the strength and resilience that I could only admire. I stared at him for a moment, taking it all in, and then I smiled. Together we faced the darkness, our hearts and souls intertwined in a bond that could never be broken. And as the dawn began to break, casting the world in shades of gold and pink, we stood there, together, knowing that we had overcome the monsters, both real and imagined. For in the end, it was our love and courage that saved us. And so as we turned and walked back towards the house, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came our way, no matter how terrifying or impossible it might seem, we knew that we could survive anything as long as we were together.